Okay. So last week we got about halfway through Revelation chapter 18. We noticed how this is kind of the actual bringing about of the judgment against this great harlot. Remember, we talked about the great harlot and the scarlet beast back in chapter 17 and identified kind of that self-indulgent, uh, fleshly desire, sinful desire that was kind of embodied in the service of idolatry, that being that harlot, that kind of what that harlot embodied. And then the beast was kind of that, specifically the political structure of the Roman Empire that sought to prop up idolatry and sought to enforce the worship of the idols and of the emperors as well. And it's interesting that here in chapter 18, what do we focus on? Whose judgment specifically is mentioned here? That of Babylon or the harlot. Okay, remember, the harlot is that great city, end of chapter 17, and that's Babylon. The beast is connected to the harlot, not that the beast is going to escape judgment, but remember, the beast was always embodied in the empire, the world empires that existed throughout time, whether it was Assyria, Babylon, all the way up through Rome. And so this beast, again, that sought to kind of, through the political structure and the governance that God had ordained and allowed, it sought to do that which was evil and sinful by supporting idolatry. Well, the focus here is the idolatry, and that's what the judgment is coming upon. The beast isn't mentioned again. And so the idea of here, chapter 18, chapter 19, it's all about that great harlot and her judgment, the sentencing and execution of that judgment. And so as we noticed, here, verse 2, Babylon the great is fallen, become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, cage, every unclean and hated bird. And I mentioned before that several commentaries suggest that this is after the destruction has taken place, after all of that has happened. And I suggest that this is its state prior to. That it's a dwelling place for demons, meaning this is where all of the sinful influence resides at the throne of Rome, at the throne of the emperor. This is where that supporting of that idolatry is. But then prison and cages are things that contain, restrain. Dwelling place isn't like that. Dwelling place is a home, as opposed to a prison and a cage. Prison and a cage suggest those who are entrapped, and that foul spirit, unclean and hated bird, speaks to the souls of those individuals who are entrapped by idolatry. They're entrapped by the sin that is being propagated by the empire. And so, as we see verse 3, 4, as this voice cries out mightily, this is describing why this is. Why are they in prison? Why are they encaged? The nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of their fornication. They've all gone along with the idolatry, along with the merchants, and as we're going to see here in a little while as well, the sailors and the shipmasters and so forth are also going to be a part of that too. And then in verse 4, there's another voice that comes out. It says, "Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues." And we pointed out the fact that the idea of coming out of her has nothing to do with leaving the world. Okay, it has nothing to do with going off on your own in an island somewhere, and that's the Christian island where all the Christians live. That's not what's being suggested here. In fact, what does Paul remind the brethren in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 when he's describing regarding that brother who had his father's wife and how he called on them to withdraw from that brother? You remember at the end of chapter 5 how he says, certainly, when I said don't keep company with those who are immoral and fornicators and idolaters and so forth, certainly I didn't mean those of the world, because then you would have to what? You have to come out of the world, remove yourself from the world. And is Paul suggesting that that's something that they're supposed to do? You can't do it. Okay, you can't do it. That's why we use the phrase, it's not necessarily a biblical phrase, but it is a biblical concept. We are in the world, but not what? Of the world. Okay, we are in it, but we're not of it. And this goes to that point, is that these brethren, these saints, the emphasis here is not that they leave the Roman Empire and go to a different country. It's that they leave and make sure that they're not being influenced by the evil. But if they are, what's going to happen? What's the warning? What's going to happen to them if they share in what she's doing? the plagues, okay, or judgment ultimately is the idea here. You are going to be judged right along with the rest of them if you join in, or if you, and as we talked about, remember the churches of Asia in chapters 2 and 3, there were some of those cities that, remember, Pergamum had kind of its own little Athens, okay, its own little hill with these different monuments and altars to the different gods of Rome, and they referred to it as little Athens because it was kind of this sense in which it had its own almost miniature place of worship where people would pilgrimage to Pergamum and, in order to worship those things. Then, of course, you had with the Thyatira, which was a place of trade and guilds, and if you didn't pour out these libations, you didn't offer up that loyalty to the gods and even to the emperor, you couldn't do business in Thyatira. And so certainly there were temptations that abounded to the saints to yield, to compromise their faith in order to kind of continue in their job or to continue in their society, to not face persecution, even if they might say to themselves, I don't really believe this, but I'm going to do it just to kind of keep everybody off my back. And that's part of this problem, is that you can't do that. You can't just say, okay, I offer my libations, go through the motions as if that's all right, when in fact you are compromising your faith. And verse 4, it's not that they're necessarily sharing in her sins in so much as they're worshiping idols as opposed to Jehovah, but that they've compromised their faith. They are involved. They're letting that influence cause them to be compromised in their faith. And remember, one of the things that Paul called on the Corinthians to not do in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14 and 17, do not be what to unbelievers? Yoked. Unequally yoked. Unequally yoked. And the idea there is having undue influence. You're supposed to be a light to the world, right? We're supposed to be the salt of the earth. Well, what happens when that influence works the other way around? So that's the problem. And that's part of what Paul's dealing with, especially in the context of those super apostles, as he's going to get to in chapter 11, chapter 12, talking about them. But those who would influence the saints for evil, as opposed to the saints influencing for good. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And certainly this seems to have that same component to verse 4 here. Do not be unequally yoked. Do not share. Do not allow your faith to be compromised because of the influence that Rome has. And then verse 5 and 6, God, he sees all the stuff that's happening. He sees all the sins that she's committing. And again, she being embodied in the empire, and specifically in idolatry. But verse 6 and 7, we notice how that there's a little bit of a pivot here, where now the voice, again, whether this is Jesus speaking, some have suggested this is Jesus speaking to his saints, and then, because he refers to them as my people, verse 4, and then he pivots to speaking directly to the Father, verse 6. Personally, I tend to think that what we have here is not just an angel, it could be an angel, I guess, in the sense that my people could be used to describe this angel in the sense of we're one and the same. But the sense of my people carries with it a sense of possessiveness. And so one possibility to this is that we're talking about Michael the Archangel. And we mentioned how Daniel chapter 12, he specifically mentioned in chapter 12, remember he's already come up in Revelation before. But in chapter 12 of Daniel, he's listed as a watcher of the people of God, a guardsman of the people of God. He watches over them and he takes care of them in that whatever role that God has given him to do, however that goes about. And so it's possible that this is the archangel speaking, and then he's speaking to Jehovah, to God, which would be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, verse 6, to render to this harlot, to Rome, what she has done to you through the saints. The persecution that you have endured, as Paul told, or as Jesus told Paul, when Paul says, "Who are you, Lord?" and he says, "I am he that you're persecuting." Okay, well, Paul didn't literally persecute Jesus, but through the saints, through the church, he was. And so, her, according to what she's rendered to you, well, the saints aren't to render out justice; they're not to mete out vengeance. That belongs to the Lord. That belongs to God. In fact, we see that at the end of verse 8. Strong is the Lord God who judges her. See, it's not his people that judges her. And it's not his people he's going to utilize to bring about her judgment. It's him. And through his means, both natural disasters and certainly the armies of other nations and so forth, that's going to bring about this downfall. We talked about verse 7, how that she's saying in her heart, I sit as a queen, as opposed to being a harlot. Yet she claims to sit as, she thinks of herself as a queen, of having nobility, of royalty, of worthy of honor and glory. She is no widow, meaning she isn't left to herself. She has all of these individuals who are coming to her, as we talked about last week, and will not see sorrow. And the exact opposite of that is what we see in verse 8 and verse 9, the fact that she is going to see sorrow. Verse 8, the plagues will come in one day. She'll be utterly burned with fire. Strong is the Lord who judges her. So then in verse 9, we see these three parties that are going to be mentioned: the kings of the earth, the merchants, and then the sailors and the shipmasters. These three are going to be standing afar off, watching the destruction of this empire. Okay, again, it's embodied within the city, but the city itself of Rome is not going to be destroyed completely and fully. It would be raided over the years following, the late 90s AD. It would have times of war and so forth, and certainly would be affected. But the city of Rome itself is not being referenced. It's the whole empire. So then, verse 9, kings of the earth who committed fornication lived luxuriously with her, will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning. There's some confusion between chapter 17, when we have these 10 mountains or kingdoms that are going to turn against her, and they're going to fight against her and take advantage of this opportunity and bring about her downfall. But remember, chapter 17, those 10 aren't literal 10. It's just a symbol of representing this fullness of strength. There are going to be people, there are going to be empires, there are going to be armies that are going to take advantage of the weakness of Rome. But all the rest of them, who were still a part of this empire, or at least were vassals of this empire, who supported this empire and loved this empire. Because notice, they lived luxuriously with her. They were made rich right along with Rome. They didn't want to see Rome fall. So all of these others, as opposed to these conspirators who would take advantage of her, all these others, they're weeping and mourning as they're seeing the smoke of her burning. Okay, now they're not being destroyed in this moment themselves, although they certainly are going to face the judgment as well because of what they did with her. But they're seeing this downfall. They're weeping, verse 10, but they're standing at a distance. Why are they standing at a distance? Because they're afraid of torment. For fear of her torment. They don't want anything to do with that. Okay, they're not going to go to her rescue. They're not going to kind of jump in there and try to put out the fire, so to speak. But they're going to stand at a distance, and they're going to mourn over the downfall of this great empire. And remember how throughout Revelation, there's always been this suggestion of the people of the world, the people of this empire, saying, what a magnificent empire we have. What can possibly take us down? We're so strong, we're so mighty, nothing can stop us. And I would venture to say that probably every world empire, the citizens of every world empire that had ever existed, had probably said the same thing. Look at us and how great we are. Certainly the kings did, the pharaohs did, Nebuchadnezzar himself, who is the God that can deliver you from my hand? What an arrogant statement. In Daniel chapter 3, that Nebuchadnezzar made to it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Okay, who is the God who will deliver you from my? He didn't say my God's hand, he says my hand, as if he's more powerful than any God could be. And this was the mindset of these rulers, especially those who sought to be worshipped, who considered themselves almost deity themselves. And the same thing was happening here with Rome. And so in verse 10, they're standing at a distance saying, alas, alas, the great city Babylon, that mighty city, in 1 hour your judgment has come. And Dwayne actually mentioned something last week that I thought was kind of interesting I hadn't thought about. Remember how we've been discussing before the times and half a time, or the 3.5 years of this war that's being described, again, not literal 3.5 years, but describing kind of that period of time in which God's going to allow this war against the saints to continue. And then it's referred to also as 42 months. Well, now we're down to in an hour this takes place. And so again, it's not so much that we're describing that this literally happened in an hour, or that it even necessarily took just 1 year, for instance, because it didn't. It took several hundred years to get to the point where that war against the saints would no longer be taking place in the empire. But the idea here is maybe we have a little bit of a countdown, so to speak. You go from that 3.5 years or 42 months all the way down to now it's happened. Okay, so it was kind of,
Or started.
or started in that sense, yeah. That in an hour this has happened, and then at the end of the hour it's done, over. But and as we noticed before, this is from their perspective. You know, it just kind of all of a sudden happened. We didn't see it coming. We didn't see the signs taking place, and it's just kind of just appeared out of nowhere. All of this in an hour, your judgment has come. And then in verse 11, we see the merchants of the earth, how they're going to weep and mourn. And why are they going to weep and mourn? Because of their economic loss, the financial loss. Huh?
Lack of trade.
Lack of trade. Notice the merchandise, that's all that's listed here in verse 12 and 13, and how much detail there is, which seems to emphasize just how wealthy the Roman Empire was, especially in its heyday, at its peak. And to be fair too, when we notice all of these things at its peak indulgence, at its peak luxury, at its peak self-decadence, you got gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every kind of ivory, every kind of object of most precious wood, bronze, iron, and marble. He's not done. Cinnamon, incense, fragrant oil, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, chariots, bodies, and souls of men. We'll talk about that last part here in just a second. But 12 and 13 describe just the breadth of economy and specifically luxury that was taking place in the Roman Empire. And the fact that this is no longer going to be happening. And remember, this empire was a world empire. We're not just talking about a nation of the world or even a leading economy or leading nation of the world. We're talking about a world empire. Well, now what do they do? I mean, this is for all intents and purposes, there's a reason why with the fall of the Roman Empire, and eventually as the empire was split into two, and then both of those kingdoms finally eventually fell down, you had what you could refer to as the Dark Ages. Okay, so we refer to as the Dark Ages. It was a period of time in which there was great disease, period of time in which there was very little advancement of technology. There was a lot of ignorance that took place, and that's why it's called the Dark Ages. And this is kind of what brought all of this to come to pass, because if the Roman Empire had continued, if it hadn't gone down the path that it had, who knows how much longer it would have survived. But it didn't, because of its sins, because it persecuted the saints. So then at the end, and some of the commentaries go into detail about some of these specifics and where they would have come from and how far away, like the ivory and the frankincense, how far away some of these luxuries would have had to have come, how expensive they were. We're talking about extreme luxury. But then at the end of verse 13, bodies and souls of men. The interesting thing about this last phrase, and there's a couple of commentaries, in fact, well, all the commentaries that I've read seem to suggest specifically that what's being described here is slaves. But I want to point out that the idea here being mentioned of the bodies and the souls of men, it's not just limited to the sense of the human bodies. Souls of men speaks throughout the New Testament, that speaks directly to the spiritual component. Well, just because I'm a slave, does that mean that my soul has been purchased as well? No. No. Okay. Their bodies may be purchased, but not their souls. Now, I suggest verse 13, is it possible that what's being referred to as slaves? Sure, because that certainly did happen. That happened throughout the Roman Empire, and certainly prior to the Roman Empire and after the Roman Empire. But I wonder, especially with the addition of the souls of men, if we're talking about verse 13, and whether we're talking about slaves or not, I guess you could include them in this, is the fact that throughout this economic prosperity that was taking place, what was happening, what was being sold and bought spiritually? So sin was being sold and bought. Okay, this is what, in essence, this decadence, this self-serving, this desire for one's own pleasure, what was being sold by these merchants in and of themselves. Is it wrong to have luxurious things? Is that in of itself wrong? What does Paul tell Timothy to tell the saints in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 17?
Don't trust in those riches.
don't trust in those things. Now, does God give us richly all things to enjoy? Sure, there's nothing wrong with having luxurious things, having a nice car, having a nice house, and so forth. There's nothing wrong with that. It's when we indulge, allow our every whim to seek to be fulfilled as if this is the be all and end all, as if this is all I'm focused on. And I trust in these riches and not in the living God who has given me these things. And so what seems to be happening at the end of verse 13 here is the reference to this is what it then led to. Okay, yes, again, slavery, I'm sure it was a part of the economic power of the Roman Empire. But the fact that souls of men are included there suggests that there's buying and selling of sin. That's what's taking place. Even though it seemed like it was just merchandise, the implication would seem to be verse 13. And then notice verse 14. Notice how soul is mentioned again in verse 14. The fruit that your soul longed for has gone from you. And this is part of what kind of suggests to me that what we're talking about at the end of verse 13 is more broad in the spiritual sense. That the fruit that your soul longed for. And this term fruit is a very unique term. You ever seen those pictures, and it always seems to represent Greece or Rome, of these servants feeding the emperor's grapes and taking them off the vine and feeding them, and they're just laying there and they're just receiving. This term fruit is that fruit which is ripe and ready. Okay, it's that fullness, that decadence, it's all ready, and it's, in fact, the term itself carries with it juicy fruit, not the gum, the idea of juicy fruit. And so your soul longed for this. Notice it says soul, your soul longed for it. Because where was their trust? It was in their luxury. It was in their military might, in their economic might. What can touch us? They had no care, no concern whatsoever. And again, the service to the idols was simply a means to an end. To be able to indulge in these things, they had gods that would allow them to do that, that wanted them to do that.
That's why they hated Christians.
They hated Christians because of the one true God, and that one true God won't let us do what we want to do. That's why they hated Christians. In fact, remember I've mentioned on several occasions how Pliny the Younger wrote to the emperor in the 130s-ish, I think it was, where he was saying that these Christians, they are a danger, they are a threat to every man, woman, and child of the empire. Why? Because it's going to keep them from doing what they want to do, ultimately. That's how they were a threat. That's how they were something that was to be avoided and to be persecuted, to be punished. And so, they're so longed for it, and that has gone from you. All these things that you sought, that you put your trust in, that which your soul longed after, desired, lusted after, those things are gone. All the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. The term here, rich and splendid, that which is rich, this term is only found here in the New Testament. This is the only time it's ever found. And it means costly. That's what the term means. That which is, it's specifically costly. And then the term splendid or radiant here at the end of verse 14. Those things that are shining. Sometimes we talk about how people are distracted by shiny things. And that's exactly the idea here, is that they were just, it kind of had devolved into whatever they wanted in the whim of the moment. That's what they got, and they were able to get it. Thoughts through verse 14. So then notice how the merchants, they're seeing the same things the kings of the earth are, but are the merchants there to help her? No, we see in verse 15, the merchants of these things who became rich by her will stand at a distance. And why are they going to stand at a distance? For the same reason the kings of the earth didn't want to be in the midst of her. They want to stand at a distance for fear of her torment. They're weeping and wailing. They're not celebrating. And those kings of the earth earlier in chapter 18 weren't celebrating. The ones in chapter 17, these 10 kingdoms, again, reference to these individuals who are these individual kingdoms and armies that sought to take advantage, they helped bring it about. But they're not part of the discussion of chapter 18. These are everyone else. And they're saying in verse 16, alas, alas, that great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. Who's being described in verse 16? Rome. Who else was described in the exact same way back in chapter 17? The harlot. The great harlot was described in the exact same language. She was wearing fine linen. She was wearing purple and scarlet. She was adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls. The exact same language that described how this harlot was adorned is what's being described here, which helps us to recognize and understand we're still in that same vein of thought. We're still describing this downfall of the Roman Empire, in particular the idolatry and the connection of idolatry to its self-decadence and desire of sinful pleasure. But then in verse 17, notice their response, once again, just like the kings of the earth said, for in 1 hour such great riches came to nothing. Remember, it was in 1 hour, the kings of the earth said, your judgment has come. It just kind of snuck up on everybody, and all of a sudden, there it is. Well, the same thing happened here in verse 17. In 1 hour. It's as if the merchants didn't see this coming either. Okay, all of these things had been building up. All of these things had kind of led to this point, and then all of a sudden, it's gone. Every shipmaster, verse 17, all who traveled by ship, sailors, as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance. And what are they doing, verse 18? They're crying out when they saw the smoke of her burning. And they're saying, what is like this great city? This great empire, through which, of course, even the sailors had their livelihood, the shipmasters had their livelihoods, because Rome, not just from a military perspective, which obviously that was a key component as well, but just in connection to the indulgence, the luxury, the pure need to ship things across the trade lines of the oceans. They had to utilize the tradesmen and the sailors in order to transport all of this stuff. And now they're seeing this happen, and they're weeping and moaning because their livelihoods are gone now too. Then in verse 19, they threw dust on their heads, and they cried out, weeping and wailing, just like the merchants, just like the kings of the earth, saying, alas, alas, that great city, in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she is made desolate. I just think it's interesting that everyone who's attached to the Roman Empire, it all happened in an hour. Again, not literal hour, but it all happened it just snuck up on everybody. They didn't see it coming. No, they weren't going to join in with the torment. They weren't going to receive that, but they're going to stand aside and they're going to watch and they're going to say, what an empire. What a beautiful thing it was. What a wonderful thing it was. How rich we were made by her. And now it's all gone. Anything through verse 19? Sorry, verse 20. Now we have God's judgment and vengeance on Rome being recognized. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her. Now we're not told who's saying this, verse 20. Presumably this is an angel. And rejoice over her, O heaven. Notice this is, and you holy apostles and prophets. Now, I would suggest that the prophets, while certainly they suffered at the hands of world empires in the past as well, the prophets of the Old Testament, I suggest that because we're talking about the holy apostles and prophets, we're talking about specifically in this time frame of the New Testament. Because, many of the apostles were killed, not just by the Jews specifically, but at the hands of the empire. So many of the apostles, at least from as far as we can track, many of them went to different places like Ethiopia, different places like Europe, and then they were ultimately killed either by the peoples that were there or certainly through the instrument of Roman discipline or punishment. And here's, the apostles have suffered, the prophets that were filled with the Holy Spirit by the hands of the apostles to prophesy and to people like Agabus and people who not only could speak of what was to happen in the future, but also to prophesy meant what else? To preach the gospel. Okay, now I think in context, certainly those who are filled with the Holy Spirit is what's being emphasized here, because the apostles and prophets is a Holy Spirit type of thing. But those who taught the gospel, those who had those gifts of the Holy Spirit and the apostles, they all suffered, certainly. Even John, who's still alive at this point, he was suffering at the hands of them. God has avenged you on her. Verse 21, then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone, and threw it into the sea, saying thus with violence, the great city Babylon shall be thrown down, and shall not be found any more. Now, verse 20, we talk about rejoice over her, O heaven. It's interesting, the New English translation, verse 20 says, God has pronounced judgment against her on your behalf. And I thought that was a really interesting, because sometimes this phrase, God has avenged you on her, sometimes the way it's translated in like the American Standard and so forth, sometimes it can be a little confusing. But the way in which this is phrased, he has pronounced judgment against her on your behalf. It wasn't just her sins in and of themselves, it was also the fact of what they've done to the saints. And then the idea of a millstone. This giant, great millstone, this angel took this great stone, threw it into the sea. How is that in any way demonstrative of violence?
Next verse or two, there will be no more sound of the millstone anymore, so there won't be any productivity or
Okay.
result coming.
So all of that millstone kind of represented this idea of energy and industry, economy, things that were happening, things that were being produced, profit, prosperity. The kind of the infrastructure of the empire, and the fact that this angel takes that and he throws it into the sea suggests it's all going to be gone. And he says, with violence, this great city. Now, certainly it wasn't only violence, but the idea of this violence, it wasn't just violence by the hands of man, which certainly armies did as well, but with great and terrible things that happened. That's the idea of violence here. The sense, again, disease, Mount Vesuvius, it erupted in, what was it, 160 or 170, I forget which, and that caused a huge problem in the Roman Empire. And then you had earthquakes that took place, and then certainly the armies as well. It was with violence, it was with great and terrible action that this happened. All right, anything through verse 21. It's interesting, Jeremiah chapter 51, wanted to point this out because this is an interesting reference going back to, let's see, Jeremiah, is that Jeremiah? Yeah, Jeremiah chapter 51. Notice what verse 60, verse 60, 64, 61 through 64. Notice what God says about Babylon. Starting with verse 60. So Jeremiah wrote in a book all the evil that would come upon Babylon, all these words that are written against Babylon. Jeremiah said to Sariah, when you arrive in Babylon and see it and read all these words, you shall say, O Lord, you have spoken against this place to cut it off, so that none shall remain in it, neither man nor beast, but it shall be desolate forever. Now it shall be, when you have finished reading this book, that you shall tie a stone to it and throw it out into the Euphrates, and then you shall say, thus Babylon shall sink and not rise from the catastrophe that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Very interesting how often the imagery given to John, it's not just John referencing things of the Old Testament, it's the imagery being given to him, being shown to him, that goes directly back to events of the Old Testament. Remember how last week we talked about that fallen, Babylon is fallen, how that reference goes back directly to Babylon itself with regard to her idols being cast down. There's a reason why these references are being thrown in here by the Holy Spirit, through Jehovah, through Jesus, in this imagery given to John, to make these connections, to understand that this is why this is happening and that God has done this before. This is not something new that God's doing. Now, it is in the sense that no empire ever before had ever been that mighty, nor will ever be like it. But God has done this before. God's going to do it again. All right, thoughts through that. All right, going to verse 22. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you anymore. No craftsman of any craft shall be found in you anymore. The sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you anymore. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore. The voice of bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth. For by your sorcery, all the nations were deceived. Now, notice, and again, it's not that as we go through history and we look at all the things that happened to the empire hit its peak around 220. That was between 180 and 220 was the absolute peak of the empire. After that, if you were to graph it out, all the events that happened, it was really the 200s. I mean, a whole lot of events happened in the 100s as well, but really, it really started in the 200s. You could just go like that. And never again would it ever be what it was. And the fact that what's being described here, isn't just the sense of, are there not going to ever be any more stores? Are there not going to ever be any more people who can make things? Not so much that. It's the sense of that prosperity and that laughter, that glee of this indulgence and this physical prosperity that they enjoyed. Never again will they have it. And that's exactly what happened. Never again did the empire happen. And the fact that he says in verse 23, again, the bridegroom and bride shall not be hurt. Again, that joy, that sense of prosperity within this society that existed, how that they didn't have a care in the world. Well, he says, by your sorcery, all the nations were deceived. What sorcery? Huh?
The way they live.
Yeah,
More around.
They evangelized regarding their idols. Okay? They evangelized, they taught and enforced the worship of their idols and the worship of their emperors as the emperors continued to come along and more sought to be worshipped and considered themselves gods. But remember how we've taught before about the beast that was of the sea and the beast that was of the earth, and how that this beast of the earth, it represented that enforcement of idolatry, and specifically the worship of idolatry, and how that it deceived many. Not that miracles were worked. It was a miracle to everyone else. They considered it a miracle, just like the people of Samaria thought Simon, when Simon was doing his sorcery, they thought he was working miracles, working godly works. Of course, they learned better, and so did Simon. Well, this idea by your sorcery, all the nations were deceived. You lured them in. Well, how? Idolatry, yes. But it was ultimately the lure of idolatry. Why worship a God who's going to be strict on me and tell me to do certain things that I want to do? Why do that? Well, that was the beauty of the lure of the idolatry of Rome, was that you didn't have to. You could have basically any god for any one set purpose, whether it was getting drunk, having parties, whatever it was. And by doing the things that you enjoy to do, sinful things, you can commune or worship with these gods. And that was that sorcery of mind, not literal sorcery, and certainly not real power, but it was that influence, that lure of the flesh through idolatry, and through it the nations were deceived. Verse 24, in her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and of all who were slain on the earth. What is it? And so one of our questions here, question 5. Go ahead and answer that, because that's what we're going to talk about here. Question 5 of our questions. What will God never forget?
All the saints are slain by God.
Every drop of blood that his faithful people shed, whether they were killed or not, but certainly those who are slain is also included. But every drop of blood, every amount of pain that was given to his people, he never forgets. And this goes back to a point that we've been mentioning on several occasions throughout Revelation, is it just people who were quote unquote martyred, who were killed because of their faith, that are promised these great things?
Other types of persecution went on.
Doesn't matter what the persecution is, whether it is one that leads to death, or they go through this great persecution and somehow they're able to survive, but yet they're still faithful. It doesn't matter. God remembers every ounce of pain, every drop of blood. Some translations, verse 20, or some commentaries, verse 24, are a little confused about all who were slain on the earth, and they think that speaks to anybody that the Roman Empire killed. And I mean, I guess you could look at it from the perspective of innocent blood, like truly innocent blood, children and things like that. You could include that, but I think we're talking about specifically, and innocent children would be included in this, people who were faithful or pure, holy. All of those that they, because of their sin, because of their decadence, because of their evil nature, they brought about the death of people, or again, in this case, we can include children in that, who were pure and holy before God. God remembers every one of them. Now, was that true for the Assyrian Empire too? Does God remember every person of faith who might have been persecuted by the Assyrian Empire?
Yes.
What about the Babylonian Empire? What about nations of the earth today? Doesn't matter who it's from, doesn't matter what the source is. All of his people, when they're persecuted, and maybe it's just a cruel name that somebody calls us. Will God remember that? Yeah. Again, whether the source of persecution is being physically abused, or mentally abused, verbally abused, emotionally abused, doesn't matter. God will remember. We remain faithful no matter what type of persecution we're facing. We were faithful unto death, regardless. God remembers. Going backwards then, question 4. In the list of merchandise in verses 12 and 13, why are the bodies and souls of men included, and what 2 possible meanings does this have? One would be the thought process of the commentaries, which would be the slaves, service of selling and buying slaves. But what would be another?
The spiritual bill of goods, the idolatry, the decadence, all the stuff associated with that.
There you go. I personally, that's the one I kind of, not that slaves weren't a part of the economic process and so forth in the Roman Empire, they were, but that especially connected to the very next verse, these things that fruit that your soul longed for. Well, it still speaks to that spiritual decadence. Question 3. Why do the kings of the earth weep and mourn when Revelation 17, 16 to 17 says they'll turn on her to destroyer? Are we talking about the same people? No. We're talking about 2 different categories. We're talking about those in chapter 17 who were just waiting for an opportunity to pounce, versus those who truly were enamored with Rome. And they were made rich by Rome. And they saw the same decadence and evil that Rome saw. Question 2, were the saints to wage war against Rome and render, repay, mix double, and so forth? Were the saints to do that? If my kingdom were of this world, Jesus told Pilate, what would his servants do? Fight. But behold, my kingdom is not of this world. Therefore, his servants don't what? They don't fight. This is being said regarding God, not the saints. And then finally, question 1, what other 2 passages do we find the cry of Babylon is fallen, is fallen? We find it in chapter 14 of Revelation, as well as in the Old Testament. And then what 2 main reasons do these passages suggest as a reason for God is bringing Rome down? Because of idolatry and because of the persecution of God's people. That's why. All right, so we're done with chapter 18. Chapter 19, part 1 notes are back here on the table, and they're also in your email boxes. We'll pick up with chapter 19 next week, Lord willing. Thank you, everybody.